It's a nice way to start, because I think I'm not sure I have my head clear on a lot of these issues. And I think one of the things that I was hoping by the time the book came out, it ended up being a concrete reality that I have answers to all these questions, and I'm actually not sure that I do. And if anything, I think my goals have been reduced somewhat in terms of the writing of this book to sort of trying to clarify some of the issues rather than trying to resolve them, because I think in many ways they're really intractable at a broad macro level. It's very, very difficult to sort of resolve these at a broad universal level. So I'm still struggling as well. So I wanted to thank you as a starting point, Matt, for inviting me here to talk about this, because it's every time you get an opportunity to talk about your work, you get to struggle anew with some of these issues, and different things come forward. So Meta offered about an hour that I could speak for. I'm going to try to speak for less than an hour, maybe 40 minutes, maybe. And I hope you don't mind if I sit down and sort of be a little more casual.
Before you get launched on that, though, I should announce something that I usually do sometime later, which is that afterwards, I always invite the speaker to supper someplace, and any of you who want to come along and continue the conversation, you're welcome to do so. We'll be going to the Duke of York, which is on Prince Arthur Street, just east of Bedford. Okay.
Okay, good. So the book is about local ownership and its relation to post-conflict peacebuilding processes. And it's really, local ownership is an ambiguous, amorphous term, which we'll talk about in more detail. But it's really a study which looks at the relationship between international actors and domestic actors in post-conflict situations. Really trying to understand the dynamics and how they play out, and how the discourse of local ownership as it's emerged has sort of affected how we perceive the relations between internationals and locals, and sort of the appropriate relations, and what kinds of relations actually generate more sustainable and, in fact, more just peace-building outcomes. So that's really the overarching theme of the book. Meta mentioned that I sort of started my academic career looking at Bosnia, and that's in fact where this book began. It began, in fact, probably about 13 years ago. I was working in Bosnia at the time as part of the international peacebuilding machinery in a relatively minor position, but in a position which gave me an interesting perch to sort of observe the peace process as it was then unfolding. And at the time, there was an international high representative in place by the name of Wolfgang Petrich, who was an Austrian diplomat. And he was a champion of local ownership. He was the first one. He was the first one from whom I had heard the term. And his argument was that Bosnians needed to embrace this peace process if it was going to work and if it was going to be sustainable. And I think there is still something to that argument. But at the same time, this was also the High Representative who spent the better part of his term imposing legislation on Bosnians when the Bosnian legislature couldn't come to agreement on its own. He spent a considerable period of time removing from office Bosnian politicians who had been elected in elections organized by the international community. So removing people for being anti-Dayton in terms of either the spirit or the letter of the peace agreement. So there was a real contradiction here. And I think, speaking, I had the opportunity to meet with him a couple of years ago, and speaking with him, he didn't see a real contradiction there. He was sort of trying to push on both sides of the argument. And it seemed to me, at the time, this highlighted a very interesting tension and contradiction within the international peacebuilding framework, and really highlights, I think, the problematic nature of peacebuilding. And interestingly, since that time, the whole idea of local ownership, the UN tends to use the term national ownership, has really become part of the contemporary common sense of post-conflict peacebuilding. It's in almost every UN document these days. But it tends to be under-specified. It tends to be loose and amorphous. It's not really defined terribly well. And so when I got to the position of being able to write a research grant to try to study some of these issues, I was interested in digging a little deeper and trying to understand exactly what it is we're talking about when we're talking about local ownership, and the significance of it in terms of peace building, and also how one might go about operationalizing it in a sensible, logical, systematic way. The other, I guess, broader contextual factor is that I wanted to begin with by way of introduction is really the problematic nature of the international peace building record over the past couple of decades. Liberal peace building is sort of the mainstream framework, and it doesn't have a particularly good record empirically. There's not a lot of cases one can point to that are sort of unambiguous successes in terms of the international community helping to shepherd war-torn states from conflict to peace. To the extent that in a lot of the literature in recent years, there's been references to the so-called crisis of liberal peace building, and a lot of scholars are raising the possibility that the liberal peace building model simply doesn't work and may in fact be inappropriate in a lot of the cases where it's been tried. There's also the question of the motivations of international actors, the range of different international actors that engage in post-conflict spaces. And particularly after 9/11, there's increasing questions raised about the extent to which the motivations of international actors in the United States, in Afghanistan or Iraq, for example, have more to do with our security, as in the security of those of us in the West, and our peace than their security, as in the security and the peace of Afghans or Iraqis. My own view on this is that the international community, just like the locals in post-conflict environments, is something you can't really deal with as a single collective category. The international community is a broad tent, and I think it's neither unambiguously benevolent nor totally self-interested. And one of the interesting issues is trying to tease out the sort of mix of motivations that comes before in any peace building operation. So my interest sort of comes from sort of looking at this context and seeing this crisis of liberal peace building emerge over the past decade or so, and trying to understand, so where does the local fit in all of this? Because one of the knocks on the liberal peace building model is that it is really premised on the idea that the primary agents of peace building are internationals, and the primary objects of peace building are locals. Right? That agency within peace building operations lies primarily with the international community. So for me and for a number of other scholars out there, it's sort of a big question mark about the role of local actors, and trying to understand how local actors and local political processes and local dynamics, institutions, local cultures can be more than simply obstacles to peace building as they're often portrayed within the international peace building dynamic. So trying to understand the extent to which and the possibilities for engaging with local actors in ways that sort of draw on local resources for peace building, rather than simply assume that all of the resources and all of the agency for peace building must come from the outside in. So with that sort of as an overview, the book really looks at trying to answer two key questions. The first one is how should we go about understanding local ownership in peace building contexts, and secondly, how to go about operationalizing it. And how should we go about trying to put local ownership principles into practice? How has this discourse actually played out on the ground in real-world peace building operations? As Meta mentioned, the book has, and the overall project, takes three core case studies. Bosnia, which is sort of emerging from my earlier research in the Balkans. Haiti is the second case study, and Afghanistan as a third case study. These are admittedly hard cases for local ownership, given the difficult nature of these environments, given the intractable nature of the situations in each of them. But they struck me as being good cases to look at in terms of trying to understand if local ownership matters, how does it matter in each of these three cases. So let me start with the first question, right? How to understand, how should we understand local ownership? What exactly do we mean when we talk about local ownership? And I start by framing sort of two different conceptions of peace building, which mirror the debate within international relations theory between universalism and particularism. So the first conception of peace building is one that I labeled communitarian, which is most closely associated with the vision of peace building from below. That is perhaps a more familiar term. And the communitarian perspective on peace building really sees that the role of the international community in peace building contexts is one of creating space, social space, political space, economic space, within which the local actors themselves, the local parties in conflict, can come up and can find their own way towards peace. The buzzword here is local solutions to local problems. And the idea here is that the way, sort of the paths to peace that local actors find don't necessarily have to accord with international norms, which in this view are seen less as universal than as Western. So trying to create the space in which local actors can come up with solutions that fit within the particular cultural and social and political context of the society in which they're emerging. So that's the first sort of vision. The second one is the more familiar liberal notion of peace building, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is more top-down, more outside in, and really views peace building almost in terms of a technocratic project of trying to transform war-torn states into functioning liberal democracies. And Roland Paris talks about this project as being one of sort of akin to a modern-day mission civilisatrice, a sort of modernizing vision of outsiders coming in and fixing broken states and making them more like us, if you will. So this vision holds, unlike the communitarian one, that global norms around domestic good governance in fact do exist and should in fact carry weight in places like Afghanistan or Haiti or Bosnia. So the idea of local ownership in this context is therefore paired with the notion of responsibility. Right? Local ownership is a right which comes with a responsibility to uphold international norms around domestic good governance. So in particular around free markets, respect for human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. So the idea here is really trying to get local actors to buy in to this model, to accept that this is just and legitimate and really the way forward in their own situations. So the local ownership piece then comes in my view, as the key issue around which these two prospects or these two perspectives actually diverge, because each holds fairly different understandings of the relationship between international and local actors in peace-building situations. And as most of you may know, the liberal perspective in practice has tended to prevail. And in most cases, local actors are expected by international donors and international organizations to really uncritically embrace and actively implement what is essentially an externally driven vision for peace building. So there's this metaphor that often comes up when we're talking about different conceptions of agency in peace building. The idea, and again, coming back to Petric, who argued that Bosnians have to be in a driver's seat when we're talking about peace building. And if we push the metaphor further, the liberal response to this is that we'll hand over the car keys once we've taught them how to drive responsibly. So it's sort of that almost paternalistic notion of parents and teenagers. Right? We're not going to let you drive until you've internalized the norms, the rules of the road, as it will. And as someone with children who will one day ask for the car keys, there's some echo there that resonates. So there's this tension, I think, around what ownership means and how ownership is actually interpreted. And I think there's also ambiguity around the question of who exactly we're talking about when we talk about the owners, right? Which local owners are we talking about? And there's a couple of different distinctions, I think, that are worth making here. And there's a need to avoid the trap of assuming that local owners are a single homogeneous entity. That local owners somehow are a single collective, which is obviously problematic in most post-conflict situations. It's probably problematic in any national context because locals are not a homogeneous group. It's particularly problematic in places like Bosnia, for example, because the very conflict is premised around the question of whether Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks see themselves as a single political community or three separate political communities. So it's not entirely clear who the local owners are in that case, where each side sees itself as indelibly distinct from the other. So there's another distinction as well, I think, less identity-based and more class-based, which is important to draw here between elite ownership and what I term societal ownership. And the basic question here is elite buy-in enough? And one of the knocks on the liberal peace-building model is that it's actually too focused on national level elites. It doesn't penetrate deeply enough into the society to actually help generate a fundamental transformation in how people think and how people behave in post-conflict situations. And I think as an illustration of this, the peace building is increasingly associated with state building, right? With the construction of national level political institutions that exist way up here, where the vast majority of people are largely ineffective. So my answer to the question is that elite ownership isn't enough, and I'll talk about sort of the problematic nature of elites in a moment. But one of the arguments I make in the book is that if properly conceived, local ownership sees locals as being a much wider category than simply elites because of the problematic nature of democratic representation in post-conflict societies. And certainly in the case of the three case studies that I look at, I think there's widespread disillusionment among the civil societies in all three cases with the results of a peace-building process, which promised much to them, but has actually delivered very well. And I think that disillusionment has helped erode the legitimacy of the peace-building process, and ultimately has eroded the peace-building process itself. So the overall argument then around sort of a conceptual piece then is that if we're going to take local ownership seriously, we need to do the hard work of trying to unpack exactly what it is we need. What do we mean by ownership? Who we're talking about when we talk about the owners? Because otherwise it just becomes another buzzword. And in fact, that's one of the critiques of the local ownership discourse, is that local ownership is simply another one of these sort of empty, meaningless buzzwords that the international community tosses around to justify its intervention in post-conflict societies, without really having any intention of making it mean anything in substance. And I think sort of there's a temptation to dismiss it like that, but I also think from my own perspective that there's still something to the concept that's worth hanging on to, and something worth probing into, because of the importance of this relationship between international actors and local actors. Now let me shift gears a bit and talk about this whole question of operationalizing local ownership principles. And obviously the conceptual dilemmas and tensions don't go away when you talk about operationalizing. In fact, they can become more evident, I think. It raises the question of how can we go about implementing a concept if we don't actually fully understand what it means, or if there's no consensus on what it means. So the case studies that I look at here are really, as I mentioned earlier, trying to understand both how actors on the ground in each one of these cases understand local ownership, how it has been put into practice to the extent that it has been put into practice in each of these cases with what effects, and how we might see local ownership differently in each one of these cases as a way of trying to improve peace-building outcomes in the future. The cases aren't strictly comparative in the sense that I'm looking at the same set of issues across different contexts, but rather each one of the case studies is really looking at different facets of the same puzzle. That's a mixed metaphor, different facets of the same set of issues. So the Bosnia case, I'm particularly interested in the fairly aggressive international state building agenda that was underway in sort of the 1999-2006 period and the impacts of that. In the Haiti case, I was particularly interested in questions of political economy and how sort of the economic dimensions of peace building, and in particular the sort of the hegemony of liberal, neoliberal understandings of economic reform have limited the possibilities for local ownership. And in Afghanistan, I was particularly interested in questions of political culture. Vast gulf between how the sort of the worldviews of ordinary Afghans and the worldviews of those in the international community who we presume to help them or fix them or build peace with them. So there was, so rather than talk about each one of the cases in any detail, I'd be happy to talk about any of the cases in more detail, maybe in the question period. But given time constraints, I thought what I would do is look at some of the cross-cutting issues that are perhaps common to each one of these cases and draw examples from each case. So there was three things that I thought were probably worth highlighting. The first one is this question of power. Right? Where does power fit into contemporary peace-building operations? And I think from the outset, there's an inherent tension within the peace-building paradigm, if you will, between continuity and change. So on the one hand, peace-building processes and the negotiating processes that lead to peace agreements that then lead to peace-building operations tend to legitimize existing power holders. Through legitimizing them by bringing them into negotiations and recognizing them as legitimate partners, through electoral processes that more often than not tend to reinforce the power of those who already have the power. It's no accident that Afghan warlords dominate the Afghan parliament, in the same way that it's no accident that Bosnia is dominated by largely the same three ethno-nationalist political structures that prosecuted the war. So there's this tendency, I think, to legitimize existing power structures, existing power holders, largely because the international community needs them as partners. Right? If they're not partners in the peace implementation process, then there is no peace implementation process. On the other hand, I think peace building is also fundamentally about trying to alter relations of power. And that's, in fact, what the whole goal of implementing the rule of law, human rights, democracy is all about. It's about empowering institutions and electorates and trying to put limits and constraints on the absolute power of those who are seen as political elites. So in this context, when we look at political elites, we see them as both the most obvious local candidates for local ownership. I mean, they're the representatives of the government, of the state, but they're also, in most cases, the most problematic. They have the most to lose in any transition to sort of liberal democracy as we understand it. And they have the most potential to subvert, given their positions, any attempts to put in place the rule of law, respect for human rights, and genuine democracy. So I was reading something from Martin Luther King from one of my classes the other day. I came across a quote which I think is particularly appropriate in this case, and he said in the context of 1960s America, but it also applies to 2010 Afghanistan and Bosnia. He said, "Privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily." And I think that applies to Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan, who's become deeply unreliable partner of the international community. It has certainly applied to a whole range of political elites in Bosnia who have done everything in their power to hold on to their political power, largely because of their abilities to translate that political power into economic power. So this idea of elite buy-in, I think, is in many ways and in many cases inherently problematic, given the vested interest in many political elites in ensuring that liberal peace building doesn't succeed, because if it does succeed, it tends to undermine their power. So I think one of the implications of this, back to this relationship between elite ownership and societal ownership, is the need to think about how to deepen democracy and how to generate stronger links to civil society. It also raises, in my mind, questions, broader questions about accountability, and exposes the limits of the international community in terms of the international community's ability to hold political elites accountable to implement their end of the peace agreement, either through active coercion or through economic conditionality. And again, I think Bosnia is the best case of this. If all of the sort of the magnetism of the European Union hasn't been able to convince Bosnians and Bosnian political elites to set aside their ethnic differences and come together in favor of the goal of Bosnia eventually joining the European Union, it's very difficult to see what kind of levers the international community has over a country like Bosnia or a country like Afghanistan. And I think one of the lessons of the past 20 years of peace building relates to the limited leverage of the international community in being able to fundamentally transform the political dynamics of post-conflict spaces. The second point I wanted to raise here in this context of operationalization relates to the question of local resources for peace. I think there has tended to be sort of, I was going to say a blank slate fallacy, but I think it's more a broken slate fallacy, this sort of idea that post-conflict countries or conflict, war-torn countries are fundamentally broken. They have no resources of their own, they have no capacity to organize themselves, and that's part of the justification for the international community, assuming that all of the agency lies with it in terms of fixing these countries. And there's a quote that I came across when I was researching the book from Roger Cohen of the New York Times, who talks about NATO's role in Afghanistan being at a very fundamental level being to drag the country out of the Middle Ages. And I think that really embodies this sort of paternalistic attitude held by many in the international community that we have all the answers to the problems of peace building and they have all the problems. And I think there's a corollary to that set of assumptions, a set of assumptions which relates to the capacity of newly introduced institutions, a sort of magical belief that if you introduce new institutions, they will have the ability to change short-term political calculations on the part of those who wield power, and also have the capacity to change long-term political culture over the longer term. And I think this may be true over the longer term, but most of us will remember what Keynes said about what happens in the longer term. Right? In the longer term, we're all dead. In the short term, and I think this is the sort of 5 to 10, maybe 15-year time window in which most peace-building operations unfold, I think it is deeply unrealistic to expect that newly introduced institutions can actually fundamentally change the political culture or political behavior of actors in post-conflict environments. In most cases, I think the causal arrows actually work the other way. In most cases, newly introduced institutions tend to be co-opted or corrupted by the political dynamics of the countries in which they're introduced. So one example is the Afghan army, which was supposed to be this great national project, which was going to bring Afghans together around this single national institution. It's been deeply and terribly compromised by factionalism. So each group has carved out its own segment of the army. The same thing I think applies to the Afghan police. To the extent that they're now part of the problem as opposed to being part of the solution. So for me, this raises a number of interesting questions about how to respond to this kind of situation. I mean, if we accept that the empirical record suggests that there are real limits on the ability of outsiders to change or to radically re-engineer post-conflict societies, the question then becomes, how do you work with existing power dynamics and existing institutions? How do you work with these societies as they are, rather than as we would perhaps like them to be? Right. So if we accept that which we cannot change, then where do we go? So I want to give two examples of this, which I think raise both the possibilities and some dilemmas in terms of actually trying to resolve this puzzle about dealing with existing political actors as they are and existing political dynamics as they are. Both of which come from Afghanistan. The first question relates to this broader issue of transitional justice, sort of traditional, not transitional, traditional justice mechanisms, versus the goal of trying to introduce a whole modern justice apparatus built around the rule of law. In the Afghan case, the initial goal of the international community was basically to roll out a modern justice system across the entire country, on the assumption that what was there previously was broken, was fundamentally corrupt, was tied to institutions of clientelism and patronage, didn't meet modern standards of due process, wasn't particularly friendly to women, and it didn't work. It became clear very quickly that the process of trying to install a modern justice system across the whole country was going to be a product of decades, if not longer. And there wasn't the appetite to stick through that for the entire time. So probably around 2005, 2006, there began to be a bit of a shift. And a recognition that in fact there was a functioning justice system in Afghanistan that existed at the village level or at the community level, built around these mechanisms of shuras and jirgas. And that most Afghans, for all of their flaws from a Western perspective, saw these as reasonably legitimate and reasonably effective. So the question became, how can we graft, or for an international community, how can we graft this kind of modern institutions of justice at a state level with traditional institutions of justice at a local level? And there's been some quite interesting work that's taken place in terms of trying to figure out how a hybrid model of justice can emerge in Afghanistan that builds on, ideally, the best traditions of both systems. So this question, I'm going to come back to this question of hybridity in a little while. But I think it's interesting in terms of trying to understand, again, how international agency can combine in interesting ways with local agency that might produce unique and context-specific outcomes. The second example deals with what's pejoratively called warlord governance. And one of the examples I give to my own students in the course on peacebuilding that I teach is a fellow by the name of Mohammed Atta-Noor, who is a warlord who's now become a governor in the northern province which surrounds Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan. And here's another example of dealing with that which we cannot change. Right? The either unwillingness or inability of the international community to actually marginalize the so-called warlords at the beginning of the post-Taliban period allowed them to entrench themselves and consolidate their power, and it's been very difficult to do anything about this. So the question of Noor, there's some interesting questions because he is clearly someone who has blood on his hands from Afghanistan's wars. Someone who is not necessarily progressive in terms of his views of human rights or gender equality, but at the same time he's someone who's actually generated a considerable degree of stability in the region he controls. He is someone who has facilitated sort of an economic revival in that particular region and has managed to keep the Taliban largely out. So it raises, I think, a broader question about whether the kind of patronage clientelistic networks that revolve around particular warlords, most of whom have their own militia still, are sources of social capital which should in fact be built upon in peacebuilding processes, or whether they represent sort of backward political structures that are regressive and need to be marginalized or eliminated in order to create space for more progressive institutions to emerge, which will ultimately lead to sustainable peace. So I think there's a fundamental question here that we're only really beginning to address in terms of some of these questions about local political dynamics and local political structures and the extent to which they are in fact obstacles to peace building or resources for peace building. Let me turn to the third issue that I wanted to raise in this context of operationalization before turning to some concluding thoughts. And it's this question that actually forms the subtitle of the book, which is around peace building as consensus building. I mentioned earlier the crisis of liberal peace building, which I think is particularly profound in each of the three cases that form the case studies of the book. I'm not sure when I chose these case studies back when I originally put the project together that I imagined that the situation in each would deteriorate significantly over the course of the research project. But most of us will be familiar with the situation in Afghanistan, which seems to get more depressing by the week, not by the day. Bosnia is in the midst of a deep existential crisis, which has led a lot of observers to wonder if the country is on the verge of going back to renewed warfare. And Haiti, well, we all know about Haiti and the struggles that country has had, particularly in the aftermath of the earthquake. There's still serious questions of political legitimacy in the aftermath of the last round of elections. And there's some worrying trends in terms of increased levels of violence, and particularly in the urban slums around Port-au-Prince. So in each of these cases, I think we can look at the billions of dollars that have been spent and the years of effort that have been invested, and conclude that the return on that investment has been actually fairly slim. And in all cases, I think, all of these cases, I think it remains the case that there is a fundamental lack of consensus around the nature of the peace to be built. And the idea of what peace building is all about, what kind of peace is at the end of the day imagining a successful peace process. And this, in my mind, is actually another indictment of the liberal peace building framework, because I think the overall idea was that the liberal peace building model, built around the four pillars of human rights and democracy and the rule of law and free markets, would provide this kind of universal template for peace building that could be agreed upon by all of the various factions in a war-torn country and by the international community. What's happened instead, I think, is that it's actually been part of that which is contested in post-conflict spaces. So you have this sort of, if I can do it on, this is where I needed a slide here. If you can sort of imagine this post-conflict contestation unfolding along a horizontal axis as well as on a vertical axis. The horizontal axis is the original conflict among the conflict parties. The vertical axis is now the struggle between the international community to impose its vision of liberal peace building, and the resistance on the part of key local actors against that vision. So it's, in a lot of ways, it sort of creates a very dynamic conflictual process that has, in my view, resulted in sort of the paralysis of peace building in each one of these cases. And in fact, I think this reliance on sort of the magical power of liberal democratic institutions has taken us away from an original view of peace building, which held that peace building, or in which peace building was fairly closely associated with conflict resolution. right? And I think consensus building is the flip side of conflict resolution. Again, on the assumption that the largely technical implementation of liberal democratic rights and institutions would in fact resolve the conflict on its own. It would I guess to use Letteron's term, it would transform the conflict by transforming the relationship between the various parties. So again, the sort of reliance on the ability of institutions to change political structures and political dynamics over the long term. And my own view on this is that I think we need, because of this crisis of liberal peace building, we need to turn back and reconsider this conflict resolution / consensus building mode of peace building. And again, if we go back to the very term ownership, I think ownership presupposes some kind of basic agreement on what exactly is to be owned. And if the liberal peace building model can in fact provide this consensus, then what needs to happen is that we need to think very hard about what might provide this consensus and how such a consensus could actually be built. And to me, it takes me back to the idea of peace building as the renewal, or in many cases, the construction for the first time of a social contract between state and society, which is inevitably a long-term conflictual process. But it's a process in which agency lies primarily among local actors. They're the ones who have to sort this out. And it behooves the international community to figure out how it can play the most effective role in terms of facilitating that kind of a process, rather than imposing its view of what the peace should look like. We come back to this question of hybridity, because I think over the life of this research project that I've been working on since 2007, there's been a lot more attention to questions of hybridity in peace building processes and sort of how the interplay of international and domestic factors can actually generate unique and context-specific outcomes that actually may be more durable than the image of peace building as one where internationals come in and fix the problems of the locals and then hand their country back to them. So I think the question of, or the issue of the term is useful here, because it takes us away from having to say that peace building processes need to be either fully foreign owned or either completely locally owned, but rather looking at the actual complex dynamics in terms of how international actors relate to local actors at both the elite level and at the national level. And again, suggesting the importance of consensus building, not only among the local actors themselves in terms of addressing the root causes along which the war was fought, but also this vertical consensus building, right? Trying to sort out relationships between the international community on the one hand and the local actors on the other, that can actually generate a common blueprint that all the actors can follow going forward. And again, I think thinking in those terms takes us far beyond thinking in terms of a peace-building operation that lasts for 5 or 10 years. Right? This is necessarily a long-term process, and internationals can, in that context, can only see themselves as facilitators, because they're not going to be on the ground in the same numbers they are now, 20 years after, 40 years after peace breaks out, as they are in the first few years. So let me conclude then with a few more general remarks, and then a few more specific remarks about policy implications of thinking about peace building and local ownership. The two general conclusions, I think the first one is about modesty. And in discussions with colleagues at the UN, you hear them increasingly talk about the need for humility, the need to get away from this idea that international actors have all of the answers to all of the problems of post-conflict societies. There's Oliver Richmond talks about liberal hubris, this idea that the liberal answer is the right answer in all cases, and if it hasn't been always successful, it's not the fault of the model, it's the fault of the way the model has been implemented. And I think getting away from that, getting away from this sort of idea that we have all the answers, allows us to ask some better questions about how exactly peace can be crafted from the pieces that exist on the ground as they are. The second general conclusion, I think, is about understanding local dynamics better. Hello. And I think what has happened in a lot of cases, and I saw this to a certain extent when I was working in Bosnia, because there was a bit of a professionalization of the peacebuilding community, in which you had these sort of footloose international actors, international citizens, who would go. They would work in Bosnia for a number, or even further back, they were in Rwanda. They would come to Bosnia for a while, they'd go on to Kosovo, then they would go on to Timor, and then a lot of them ended up in Iraq before ending up in Afghanistan. And so what you had was sort of this technocratic class of international civil servants who had become experts in sort of the machinery of liberal democratic peacebuilding, but not necessarily experts in the countries in which they work. Right? If it was 2008, this must be East Timor. If it was 2010, it must be Afghanistan. Right. And again, I think it's part of the sort of universalizing nature of the liberal peacebuilding project. It doesn't matter where we are, the solutions are actually the same. And I think that's come at a cost to a more deep sociological and anthropological understanding of the societies in which peacebuilding is actually attempted. And I think a greater attention to questions of local ownership forces us into more nuanced analyses of what local resources for peacebuilding exist, how locals actually understand their conflict, as well as how they understand some of these broader questions of justice and peace and legitimacy, as well as trying to understand how international can actually facilitate the kind of hybrid strategies that I was talking about earlier. In terms of the more specific policy recommendations, and this is sort of the last thing I wanted to talk about, one of the things that has happened towards the end of this project is that I began to have some discussions with some policy people in the United Nations, trying to generate a discussion with them about questions of ownership and trying to deepen the analysis around national ownership, which, as I mentioned earlier, has become increasingly part and parcel of the UN discourse around peacebuilding. So these discussions resulted in a one-day workshop that we organized at the Peacebuilding Support Office in New York, part of the Peacebuilding Commission, which took place in March of last year. And from that, we sort of pulled together a set of policy recommendations, because the workshop was really around moving from the rhetoric of ownership to the actual operationalization of ownership. And that's led to an occasional paper that will, I'm hoping will come out, be published by the Peacebuilding Support Office in the next few months, which really looks, I mean, given the nature of the United Nations system, looks at sort of incremental ways in which national ownership, local ownership principles can actually be put into practice. So let me just mention a few of them by way of conclusion. One of the other buzzwords around peacebuilding is capacity building, which again raises a set of assumptions about who has capacity and who doesn't. And there's been increasing consideration given to questions of capacity in post-conflict environments, and I think one of the starting points is simply a do no harm principle, which suggests that that international capacity shouldn't be used to replace local capacity where local capacity exists. And obviously that implies an analysis of the local capacities that actually do exist, as well as shifts in ways in which projects are implemented. The typical way of implementing a project was to have a separate project implementation unit, separate and apart from the national government structures, which obviously undermines the capacity of any national government structures to actually manage and run and gain capacity through implementing projects. Even something as simple as procurement policies, and having policies in place which suggest that where a local ability to provide goods and services exist, you shouldn't bring in international goods and services which actually replace those that exist locally. So that's the capacity building side. There's also from the donor side, not necessarily from the UN side itself, a need to really reconsider this phenomena of projectism, which is another one of these sort of pejorative words, but it really gets to the idea that donors want to fund projects which have concrete deliverables, which have clear guidelines in terms of what will happen when, with what outcomes, and they want to be able to see visible outcomes from projects, and these tend to be foreseen in relatively short-term time frames. So this kind of notion of projectism tends to privilege outcomes over processes, and tends to privilege efficiency over ownership. And it's, in my view, one of the reasons why countries like Haiti end up being what was once described to me as a graveyard of failed development projects. Because if you don't build in any mechanisms by which to ensure sustainability of projects beyond the funding cycle of the projects, then it should come as no surprise to anybody that once the funding dries up and the internationals leave, that the project collapses in on itself. So thinking through how to build considerations of local ownership into project design and project management, project implementation, I think is one obvious way in which local ownership can be operationalized. And then the third and final point relates to the question of broadening the domestic constituency for peace building, beyond the sort of elite focus, more towards trying to engage civil society and the population at large. And really it's a question of taking seriously questions of participatory peace building, in which a much wider range of the citizenry is actually engaged in peace building. So stronger roles for civil society, obviously a greater level of dialogue between the top-down and bottom-up peace building processes. And this is this area where, in fact, the post-book research has taken myself and a few colleagues, where we're now looking at this question of how the top-down approaches to peace building can relate to bottom-up approaches, which emerge more from the grassroots. So that's sort of what we're looking at now, and where we'll be looking at for a couple of years. And we're looking, in this case, at questions of community-level security in places like Haiti, as well as youth engagement in Sierra Leone, which is a new case study for us. So let me leave you with a quote from Diana Francis, who is a British peace scholar and activist, who suggested at one point that peace anywhere must be built by those who live there. And I've always liked this quote because it really, I think, nicely sets up and places questions of agency really at the forefront of peace, and suggests that ultimately, at the end of the day, we should be thinking of the primary actors in peace building as being local actors, and ourselves as outsiders as being best facilitators. So let me leave it there. Thank you for your...
All of what you said really resonates with me and my limited understanding of peace building. Are you aware of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict at all?
I'm in fact trying to meet with somebody in New York there in a couple of weeks. So I haven't actually had a lot of contact with them, but I'm hoping to start.
I was in Costa Rica 3 years ago, and I met Paul Van Tongeren.
Okay, I actually know Paul.
Okay. Because their approach is peace councils, which, and I have case studies from Ghana and Kenya, where they have the local peace council, the regional peace council, and then the national peace council. And so the local councils are looking after their local issues, and they could be very different from what the rest of the region is involved in. And so what GPPC does is they get alongside these people and, as you say, facilitate them and help them with resources to accomplish the things that need to be accomplished at that. And then they can branch out, and the regionals are looking at entirely different issues in many cases. And so it's been quite effective, and I'm sure you'll have some very interesting conversations with them.
Yeah. No, I mean one of the things I looked at while I was researching this is I mean Paul did a couple of books on civil society peace building, looking at success stories of civil society peace building. I mean, one of the things for me that's always struck me about sort of grassroots peace building, and I guess one of the research questions that I have relates to the extent to which these grassroots peace building can actually generate enough critical mass to impact higher up on the political system. And that's partly with this sort of question of trying to relate the top down to the bottom up. The original paper I wrote, which tries to deal with some of these issues, was based on a project that Concern Worldwide, which is an Irish aid agency, was implementing in one of the urban slums in Port-au-Prince. And they're really looking at community peace building. So the question I was asking was not only about the success of that on its own terms, in terms of sort of making communities safer and making life better for people at the very grassroots level, but how those kind of processes can actually trickle up the political system. And it led me back to people like John Paul Lederach and sort of his argument about peace needing to be built from the top down, bottom up, and middle out, and leading to questions about where's that middle, right? Where are the people who exist at the middle strata of society who can actually be sort of the intermediaries between political elites at the higher level and the people at the grassroots level. So looking at questions of security in sort of urban slums of Port-au-Prince, it leads you almost immediately to questions of, so where are the police in all of this? And in this case, there's some tensions there, because what Concern was trying to do, they were trying to negotiate with, really trying to reconcile with some of these gang leaders and convince them to come out of the cold, if you will, and lay down their weapons and become community leaders rather than gang members. Which contrasted with the police approach, which was basically come in and arrest everybody they could find, put them back in jail. So there's some tensions, I think, and so one of the questions I'm interested in is there a way to reconcile some of these different approaches? Because typically you find at the high levels, the top-down processes versus the bottom-up contain some fundamentally different assumptions about how peace is to be built. And it may be worth looking at more of the GP, it's a GPPAC, I think?
Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, GPPAC.
Yeah, I see.
Where have they functioned, you know?
Ghana and Kenya are the two sort of test cases that I've read about, but they're involved in, I think, half a dozen or maybe as many as a dozen African nations and other places as well. Another recent example, and again, that's just something I read the other day, was a peace agreement signed in the Philippines within about the last 30 days. And non-violent peace force was very, very much involved in the process there. And so what you're talking about, by getting, rather than arresting people, encouraging them to lay down their weapons and becoming a part of the community, was a very significant part of that whole process. And so they're very hopeful that this will be a lasting peace because it has been done so differently and because local actors were very involved in the whole process.
Yeah, I mean, it raises some fundamental questions about resourcing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you're going to look at building peace up from the community level, there's a lot of communities, even in the smallest country. Right? So how do you make sure that resources go out and people are accountable for the use of resources, and how do you make sure that those processes actually...
If we were funding peace builders with those kind of skills,
yeah,
rather than funding guys with machine guns,
sure,
we could accomplish 1,000 times more effective peace building in this world.
No, I would disagree.
No?
Other questions?
What did you say you don't think they do what? What was your last statement?
Well, we were talking about funding people with machine guns versus people with
With peace building.
Local peace-
And
local
so
peace
you were
builders.
saying if you could take those people with their skills and
No, if you could move the money from the
Yeah.
people with machine guns to the local level peace
The
builders,
money.
you would make a huge difference.
And you think not?
No, I do think, no, I agree.
Oh,
I
that's
didn't-
what-
I
that's
didn't
what
disagree. I'm
I'm
sorry, I
thinking.
was wondering where the confusion was there.
Yeah.
I think I said I don't disagree. At least that's what I meant to say anyway. Yeah, no, I totally agree. So I mean, it's one of the reports I actually found to be quite to sort of shape my views around this sort of local community peace building approach was a report that was done in Afghanistan about which is really calling for a national community level peace building strategy and trying to get away from this idea that community peace building, as it has happened everywhere. I mean, it tends to be the cult of the pilot project in so many cases, right? Where you have all of these various fragmented, unconnected, poorly funded, short-term pilot projects, and at the community level, really trying to test the concept of community peace building. And this particular report, I'm trying to remember which organization did it. I can look it up in a minute. This particular report basically said we don't need any more, or at least that's the conclusion I drew from it. Was that enough with the pilot projects already? If we demonstrated that these things can work at a community level, we need to seriously think about how community level peace building becomes part of the broader framework of peace building writ large and is funded accordingly. And that, I think, is a fairly compelling argument in terms of how you actually engage people at the local level.
You want to come with me and visit MPs?
Where?
Visit members of parliament and talk to them?
Oh, yes, you have to.
You know, we have to
He
get
would
that.
give you a run for your money. What is it, 52 MPs you've visited by now?
Yeah,
He
over the
lobbies
last
people.
4 years, I guess.
Yeah, that's his avocation, lobbying MPs.
Good for you. It's probably a thankless task, I imagine.
Oh, for sure.
In this particular environment.
Well, one of the hardest was Chris Alexander, who was our ambassador to Afghanistan. And prior to the election, when he was campaigning, I talked to him. I told him I'd be in to see him about establishing a Department of Peace in government.
Right.
And he said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, come and see me. So he did get elected.
Mm-hmm.
I went and saw him. We had a really enthusiastic talk, and he said he wanted to bring together people in Ajax, which is where he was elected, to discuss these issues and really get the grassroots involved in shaping government policy. Didn't hear from him for 3 months, and I went back, and he basically just showed me the door and said, this isn't going to happen, you're wasting your time. After 3 months under Harper's.
Yeah, well, he probably.
From an enthusiastic guy who knows the situation in Afghanistan
Yeah.
thoroughly, has written a book on it,
Yeah.
knows that this is what's needed,
Mm-hmm.
and Harper was able to shut him down in 3 months.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's
cool.
discouraging. I just looked up the report that I was mentioning was an Oxfam report called in fact Community Peace Building in Afghanistan, the case for a national strategy. So Matt Waldman was the author of that 2008.
The strategy for the finances in Afghanistan is horrendous. I was at a talk a few months ago, and it's all been set up so that not one Afghani can make money. I can go in there and make more money. You can set a company up. It's horrendous. It should be criminal. It's total exploitation of a country and a race.
Can you talk more about that? Why it's impossible for Afghans to make money?
But it's why it's set up that it's total colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way it's been set up, so that anybody can go in there and buy a piece of land or set stuff up.
Right.
There's no mandate set up in there that you have to, employ anybody or anything. You can bring the whole world in there and screw every Afghani and, walk away with the gold or oil or whatever it is and not give a penny to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's horrendous.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know how any of us can let this happen.
Yeah.
Well, we're letting it happen in Canada with this dictator we got, Stephen Harper, Somehow we've got to start jumping up and down logically and start saying, enough is enough, we want our country back.
Mm-hmm.
This thing that's going on out west with the food that's been sold to this company down in Brazil. How did that happen? Why did it happen? Through bad management, bad company. I've just seen
Yeah, no.
I've just seen something that's made me so bloody passionate. I just feel like going up to Harbour and say, get out of this country,
Yeah.
you're treasonous. Which he is.
Anyway, I'm not going to talk to the Canadian side of it, but I mean, I
Yeah,
will.
but
let
the
me talk a
Afghanistan,
little bit about
that's horrendous.
the Afghanistan thing, because I mean, one of the, I mean, let's get back to the broader question of financing. I mean, in this question, we were talking earlier about capacity building. I mean, one of the fundamental problems with capacity building is this whole fear around corruption within state level institutions, within post-conflict societies. There was a time at which I think upwards of 80 or 90% of American aid money to Afghanistan was actually going around the national government rather than through the national government, because there was such a fear about how much of it would get lost to corruption. So you end up creating these whole parallel institutions outside of government that implement projects, and then when the money's gone, they shut down and pack up and leave. Right? And there's absolutely no capacity being built. I mean, in Haiti, it's just as bad or worse, where a huge percentage of international assistance, particularly after the earthquake, went around the government rather than through the government. And there was obviously problems with the government in the aftermath of the earthquake because of the lack of capacity because of the earthquake. But when Paul Farmer, who's now the UN, I think he's the deputy special representative for Haiti. Now he's been in for a couple of years, and he's been using this concept of accompaniment, which I think is actually incredibly valuable. Which is it's not that we should stop worrying about corruption or stop worrying about money going into the pockets of politicians. What we need to do is we need to keep track of money as it goes through the system, but it absolutely has to go through governmental institutions, because A, it's their country, and B, you'll never have any hope of building a functional state that can effectively deliver any kind of program unless you begin to work with them. And again, he's talking about a long-term process, but there's always this idea of you shortcut problems with corruption and lack of capacity by avoiding the problem rather than confronting it directly and fixing it. And I mean, Bosnia is a similar case as well. There was a report by the New York Times in '99 which said that upwards of $1 billion of reconstruction assistance was lost to corruption, and everybody just froze up. So thinking through that kind of question with regard to capacity building as well is also imperative, and I think people like Paul Farmer are probably at the forefront of trying to figure out how to work through government institutions rather than around.
But I think
Describe that accompaniment idea. What exactly would he have people do?
Well, I mean, Haiti is a strange place, and there's a reason they call it the Republic of NGOs, because it's partly historical, partly because of the way the Duvalier regime basically abdicated responsibility for social policy and delivery of social services, that primarily international NGOs and international charities have largely taken over service delivery, social service delivery. So the majority of schools, the majority of hospitals tend to be private, and they're run by international NGOs and international charities. So the state has very low capacity. They really don't even have a clear sense of who's out there doing what. And it's totally separate from the state. And so for an American, if you're an American NGO, and if you see this terrible earthquake and you say we want to set up an orphanage in Haiti, you just go and you do it, right? And you run it through your own organization. You don't have to be a subsidiary. You don't have to go through Haitians. You don't have to go through the government. You basically just subcontract it to a local organization, which is largely run by internationals. Right? So we don't have to worry about Haitians who are corrupt or Haitians who don't speak English, or we can basically implement these projects ourselves. What people like Farmer are saying is that there is no way a country like Haiti can be sustainable, ever, unless you give the state the basic capacity to be able to provide, or at least manage, oversee even, what's going on in terms of its health system and its education system. So what he's arguing is that I mean, these private hospitals exist, and they do good work in a lot of cases, probably in most cases. But what you need to do is you need to work with the Ministry of Health, the Haitian federal state level Ministry of Health, and build up some basic fundamental capacity within the ministry to be able to provide a national strategy or a national health infrastructure. Because otherwise, if there's another crisis somewhere else and international funding gets distracted and all of a sudden Haiti gets less money than it does now, everything falls apart. Right? So the idea of sustainability for him requires that you actually need to build up within institutions of state the basic capacity that will exist independent of the international community's financing of it, independent of the international expertise that may exist with it.
And how are you going to do that?
Slowly, right? I mean, he's doing it. He's doing it. I mean, he's. I mean, one of these people who's very committed to working with. I mean, he's not afraid to work with Haitian ministers. He's not one of these people who says that because you're a senior Haitian politician occupying a senior post that you're deeply corrupt and uninterested in the fate of ordinary Haitians. There are those people, but there are also a lot of people within those institutions who probably do care. And so the question is finding champions who are within government ministries who are actually interested in reform and interested in providing services for Haitians, and working with them, trying to build up some capacity that can sort of.
The solution already.
Sorry?
The solution already exists, though. Their management systems.
Mm-hmm.
How do we build the space shuttle? Management system. So the systems we need to put into a country already exist. But nobody's looking laterally at using an engineering management system into running a country. And North American, because of the corruptness of North America itself, they start shortcutting the systems we've got here to do with the environment and everything, so they can make more money. So we're screwing ourselves all the way around.
Right.
And they just go hand in hand. The system exists. Nobody wants to put in a good management system. They start getting management systems put in, or climate, whatever it is, that control stuff with the right feedbacks, and then because people want to exploit it, then they start taking it out.
Yeah.
And nobody jumps up and down and sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Sorry.
It's okay. But back to this, one of the things we were talking about in the talk is I mean, almost precisely this question of systems.
Yeah.
Right, and we were talking about sort of the sort of liberal peacebuilding model as a system, right? And the idea that peacebuilding is about taking this model and basically transplanting it in Haiti or in Bosnia or Afghanistan, which is the three cases, without taking into account political culture or history or traditions. And really, what a large part of what I was talking about is about how that's a flawed system, and how you need to actually work with local institutions and political culture to generate, I guess, hybrid systems that fit better within those cultures and contexts, while at the same time taking the best from sort of the ideals of Western liberal democracy, in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability, in terms of sort of systems in which states and citizens actually have some kind of relation.
Well, in Afghanistan, there was whole loads of systems set up for women to get women educated, a whole lot, and then Harper interfered with it, and it was all, they didn't want to know. They sent the information back, and they said, no, you can't have this, and I had to rewrite the thing to fit in within a political agenda, screw the fact of what the reality they needed to achieve.
Yeah.
It just needed to be written in political words, and which didn't achieve anything of what they were achieving when they're actually doing the stuff on the ground. And it all got screwed up.
Yeah.
I have a question related to that. I don't know, the sentence that you said, I think was Roger Cohen about taking them out of the dark ages. And I think sometimes, I don't know what you think about globalization, seeing Western versus like other regions of the world. We have gone through different histories. So what I feel sometimes when we try to impose, like as much as I wanted women to be completely equal everywhere where they are not even here, I think that some things need to evolve on their own, and you can, from us, even if I go to Kansas and start saying that I'm an astronomer, the world was built billions of years ago, no, God, 6,000 years ago, I cannot impose it, that has to be learned on their own. So how much is that taken into account in peace building? Because we have our perspective in classes
Sure.
with their perspective.
Yeah. I mean, this is the case of gender equality in Afghanistan is one of the issues which always trips me up when I talk about this sort of argument around local ownership, right? That you need to actually accommodate local traditions and local values and local institutions, because that's one of these cases where we talk about hybridity. Right? How can you come up with a hybrid system that will both accommodate sort of these the traditional Afghan patriarchy and Western conceptions of gender equality? And it's nice to think in terms of hybridity, but I think there's a lot of issues, and I think that's one of them, where it's very difficult to come up with sort of consensus, right? A middle ground somewhere, and it's difficult to have a conversation with people in the UN as well about to what extent are we willing to, or are you willing to compromise on sort of basic fundamental principles for which the UN stands, human rights being probably the most iconic, in the interests of generating consensus and generating agreement with people that are in positions of power on the ground. So I think that's a really difficult question. I mean, I tend to agree with you. I tend to believe that I mean, there is no way we're going to generate gender equality. We are going to impose gender equality in any meaningful way in Afghanistan simply by mandating that girls go to school. I mean, it's the question of changing mindsets is one that's I mean, a question of generations,
Yeah,
not a question of.
From my perspective, it has to be generations of education.
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
we actually go towards education, and then the next generations will do it themselves, but within their
Yeah.
countries. No, we impose them because
Yeah.
it's like
It doesn't. I mean, it just generates resentment.
Exactly. I think historically we have to feel that the United Nations might have some human right now,
Yeah.
but 100 years ago women couldn't
Yeah.
vote, and it's only 100 years ago. And I think when we're going to other countries, it's like going in a time machine.
Mhm.
That's why I like Ascendance of the
Yeah.
Dark Ages so much, because they need to evolve on their own.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening in Afghanistan, I mean, I think it is evolving. I mean, there are lots of Afghans who are fighting tooth and nail every single day for human rights and for women's rights, and I think this debate is ongoing, right? The question is whether what can be done by the international community to actually facilitate the evolution of that discourse within an Afghan context. I mean, I was really, last time I was in Afghanistan, it was 2009. I worked with an interpreter, a young fellow, spoke great English, progressive in every way, and he took me on one of our off. It was Friday, which was basically the weekend. He took me to the Kabul Zoo, and there was a zoo there with a sort of amusement park, and there were some girls riding one of these amusement park rides. And he turns to me and says, "Oh, they're all prostitutes. They shouldn't be there. They're all prostitutes. We should go somewhere else." And it was the first thing he had said that kind of struck me totally out of the blue. But it left an impression on me because clearly, in deep in his heart, right, he didn't think that women should be riding the amusement park rides. They had their place and they should be somewhere else. So those kind of deeply held beliefs, I don't think are going to change overnight. And I agree with you that it's a question of education. So we can set up the institutions and create opportunities, but at the end of the day, it's really going to be Afghan women who are going to secure their own rights in Afghanistan. It's not going to be the international community. I wish it were otherwise, but.
I have a different angle. I have an angle which wouldn't be top down or bottom up, but maybe sideways. And that is soap operas. If you really, I don't believe that we should just sit back and watch and wait for evolution to take place and the liberation of women to occur. I think.
But you end up abandoning entire generations of women.
Yeah, I'm not ready to do that. And I mean, same as I'm not willing to say, okay, there's slavery, let it be until they decide to change their mind. I'm somebody who wants to go out and fix people. Now, I'm sorry, but that's the way I am, and you can't make me otherwise. But I do have some better ideas about how to do it, and that is instead of going in and taking over and saying, now you do this and you do this, you get a radio station and you write really good scripts of stories that are listened to on the radio as soap operas. And this is something I've investigated quite a bit. Of all the methods I have ever studied for changing cultures through a planned decision about how we want to change attitudes, that is the most powerful. And it started in Mexico with birth control, Planned Parenthood and contraception and all of that. And it was developed by a Mexican man who, what you do is you start off with a story about a family that has the typical Mexican attitudes, and you just work in a little bit in their drama. The rest of the drama, you have all the other activities going on, but every time you work in a little bit about this, and you start with a typical attitude, but then you have events happen that force people to change their attitudes, and it takes a year or two before you move the characters from one point of view into quite a different point of view. And the most dramatic changes took place in Mexico as the public began to listen to and follow the reasoning and have the debates themselves privately. The thing about it is you're not imposing on anybody. They can turn off the radio anytime they want to. They're listening and for their own pleasure, voluntarily, and they don't feel abused, and they don't feel you're doing anything to oppress them. You're just expressing a different point of view, and this works. It works in terms of I've seen the results for increasing enrollment in adult education for illiterate Mexicans. And another study in a lot on health effects like HIV. In Africa, Tanzania had a wonderful radio show that changed behavior enormously about a truck driver and his wife who, and it was a very powerful thing. If I had, anything to do with trying to change attitudes toward and treatment of women in places like Afghanistan, it would be by setting up a radio or, if they had TV, I'd use TV, but probably they don't have access to TV, I don't know. But anyway, a radio show that would play every day, especially if it's a time of day when the husband is home and he listens too, in the evenings, for example. I think that's the most powerful thing we could do.
Makes me think of Archie Bunker.
I was thinking of Archie Bunker too.
Archie Bunker, all the time you were speaking of what that did too in North America.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent this is happening, and some of it's happening within Afghans by Afghans. I mean, and it's dangerous work. And I mean, some of you may know this story better than I about the Afghan. She was a television personality. She had her own, I think it was a talk show. A woman who was, I think, was an Afghan Canadian who went back after the war and ended up with her own talk show. And she had to come back to Canada. She ended up in Vancouver again because her life was threatened. Because this wasn't seen by the hardliners, the real conservatives, as being an appropriate thing for an Afghan woman to do. And I don't know whether she was particularly liberal or what her program was about necessarily, but just the very fact of having an Afghan woman as a television host was seen as a threat. In the same way that the Pakistani Taliban saw the very existence of a 14-year-old schoolgirl in school as a threat. So I mean, these struggles I think are unfolding now. Although the problem is that it's very dangerous work, and a lot of people are putting their lives on the line.
Not always. I mean, sometimes I think if it's dangerous, it's oftentimes because you jump too far ahead of where people really are. You want to actually get the whole discourse of the society moving in the same direction over a longer period of time. There's an outfit in Rwanda. I talked to a guy in Oslo about a year ago who was involved with a radio show in Rwanda in which they, it involves local Hutus and Tutsis and so on, and working out things. And they have really made on-the-ground changes in their relationships. And he gives us stories about people actually helping the farmer when he got sick and couldn't pull his weeds or something. So this other group goes in and helps, pull the weeds or whatever it was. And showing that there are very real peace-building effects of this drama. Yeah.
No, I guess when I think of the danger of that kind of work, I'm thinking of the Afghan women who actually, the brave Afghan women who actually a couple of years ago demonstrated on the streets outside of the Afghan parliament and they ended up being stoned by ordinary Afghan men.
We've talked a lot about local projects to own peace-building processes, but I'm wondering if there's anyone in the peace scholarship who advocates for a lack of intervention by the international community and just relying on local agency to produce peace.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Let me give you two answers to it. I think one of my hesitations with that kind of an approach, this sort of creating space approach, is that it presumes that local actors will eventually find their way to peace through peaceful means. And as we stopped at the very beginning, my formative experience as a researcher on peace and conflict issues was in Bosnia. And really, I can look back at the war in Bosnia from 1992 to 1995 as a locally owned conflict resolution process, right? That was obviously less than ideal. So I think it's probably dangerous to simply assume that if you let the local actors work it out themselves, that they're going to create a just solution through peaceful means. So I think there's a danger there. At the same time, that's the first side of it, so I'm going to kind of contradict myself now and talk about a couple of cases where there were successful cases of post-conflict peace building where there has been, in fact, very little international intervention. Rwanda is one of those cases, right? Where in the aftermath of the war, when the RPF took over the government, they didn't need or want the international community. They saw the international community fundamentally betrayed Rwanda. So if you can send money, but we're running the show, we have the agenda, we know what we're going to do with it, and if you want to be part of our program, you're welcome to contribute. If you don't, you're welcome to just stay out. And I think that's one of the it's one of the cases which is interesting in terms of a locally owned peace process, because you get both sides. You have a very strong leader in Kagame, right, who knew where he wanted to go, who knew where he wanted to take his country, and Rwanda has become the sort of economic success story of Africa. At the same time, there are a lot of people who will say, well, it's also deeply authoritarian. The conflict has never really been resolved. It's just that you have a strong leader who's basically put a lid on it. The other example of locally owned peace building that often comes up is South Africa, where again you had strong leadership and relatively little influence on the part of the international community, but you had a really strong process which had a lot of grassroots involvement when they were doing consultations on constitutional reform, and they had literally millions of submissions from ordinary South Africans. Right? They rewrote their national security laws a few years ago. And again, wide open public process. So in many ways, for all the problems in South Africa, I think there's a lot to respect there as well. And there's some other cases at the margins which haven't gotten international attention, they've been basically allowed to unfold on their own. Somaliland is one of them. Bougainville is another one. These sort of cases which nobody's really ever heard of, but cases where there's been locally owned, because there's never been any international imposition of a liberal peace-building model, that they've kind of emerged organically. And Somaliland is really the only part of what was once Somalia, that's self-governing and relatively stable.
No big headline saying peace breaks out.
No.
No.
But again, I mean, it's based on traditional governance structures because that's all there was, right? I mean, that's what people knew. So I think there's something to that. I just don't know how you translate that into a case like Afghanistan or Bosnia, where you don't have a Nelson Mandela or you don't have a Paul Kagame that can actually provide the kind of leadership necessary to bring the country together and actually
And the context
carry
is
something
different
forward.
too,
So, yeah.
right? Because there's already been intervention in Afghanistan before this current
Yeah.
conflict broke out. So I think we have a responsibility because of a North American country. We were already
Right.
implicitly involved in previous conflict. So I think we have an obligation. But I'm just wondering if it's right for European, North American society to intervene into countries that they didn't really have any.
Well, it's a good question.
Involvement in the
I
past.
think of Bosnia and whether,
Yeah.
it's been 17 years now since the war ended in Bosnia,
Mhm.
whether the country would have been better off without this massive international peace-building effort. And it would have been better off if partition had been allowed to happen.
Right.
Right? It may happen anyway,
Mhm.
which would ultimately be a tragedy for those, I think, who care about Bosnia, but it might ultimately be the only way forward. But it's an interesting thought experiment, at least.
I'm curious to know if you have your best example of what you're suggesting might work, where there is international, I was going to say interference, but at least international involvement. You felt that it was not a takeover by the internationals, but there was a working with. Is there any situation that you are aware of that moves in the direction that you're?
I don't know any country case where there's been a real radical reconsideration of the relationship between the international community and local actors.
I couldn't think of it either.
No, I mean, I think the international community as a whole is still committed to this template of liberal peace building, and I think it's difficult to escape. I mean, there are cases, I think, where you can see some of that, and I mentioned one of them in terms of the way traditional justice mechanisms in Afghanistan are slowly being incorporated into governance structures. I mean, and you see that in places like Sierra Leone as well, where the traditional chiefs have been incorporated as part of the formal governance structures. I'm not sure that's the most successful example because the chiefs are, I mean, they've made things very difficult for a lot of people, and there's a lot of resistance to legitimizing the power of the chieftains. I mean, there are cases as well, I think, where, and ironically, given what we were talking about in Afghanistan, cases, relatively successful cases of funding grassroots level engagement from the top down. I mean, of all the problems in Afghanistan, I think one of the more successful examples is the National Solidarity Program, where there was the facilitation of community development councils in 55,000 villages. Huge project. Logistically, almost impossible. But these community development councils were basically given the mandate to identify development projects that needed to happen in their own communities, and then they could apply for funding, and funding would come down, and they were allowed to manage and implement those projects themselves. And by all accounts, it's probably one of the most successful projects that has taken place in Afghanistan since the fall of the Taliban. So there are isolated cases, I think, where there's been some relatively enlightened leadership that's sort of trying to push the boundaries of what's acceptable in terms of this question of local ownership, but I don't know of any case as a whole where this has happened.
But perhaps more people are beginning to question the way things have been done.
Mm-hmm.
like you and others and are looking at it.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and certainly one of the things that I took away very clearly from this workshop we held in New York, where we had over 50 people in the room. They were members of country delegations. There were UN civil servants from UNDP and the Peacebuilding Commission, and part of peacekeeping operations, and a whole range of civil society actors. And that was the clearest message was that this question of humility that I mentioned earlier, that we really need to step back and think a little more clearly about what we're doing and what we assume about who knows what and who has the solutions and who doesn't have the solutions. So I think that the thinking is beginning to change. How the practice has changed, I think, is the next step. It's also difficult, I think, for international donors to think through where local ownership fits in because of the fiduciary considerations of trying to make sure that every dollar spent is actually accounted for. Right? It's this idea of development projects needing to have concrete deliverables within a fixed period of time is not very conducive to local ownership, because local ownership is like any democratic process, right? It's messy and it's time consuming, and the outcomes are uncertain in many cases. So thinking through in terms of donor perspective of where ownership considerations fit in. They all speak the language of ownership, but not many actually think through what it would actually look like to put more power in the hands of the recipients as opposed to the hands of the donors.
This young lady wants to say something just that.
It got covered regarding the rights of girls to education.
Okay.
But
I can't hear you.
regarding what you guys already covered regarding the rights of girls to education. One of my concerns, I feel, is like if the girls currently don't have any access to any kind of education, like how do they really know to sign up for their rights? Because like if they've been brought up in a society where they're constantly told you just say that it has and that's 70% of your responsibilities and whatnot, how do they know how to venture out?
They watch soap operas.
Yeah.
I mean, if I can put it in a slightly broader context, I mean, I think it is back to the fundamental question I raised about power,
Yeah.
right? How do you, I mean, from an international perspective, if what you're trying to do is level the playing field
Right.
in a country like Afghanistan, so the conversation can at least happen about holding governments accountable or women standing up for their rights. I think that's a really difficult question in that kind of context. And again, it relates to these questions of warlords. And if you accept that these guys have power and are going to continue to have power, and we need to work with them because we can't get rid of them, then you're really accepting that wherever these warlords are in power, that there's going to be very little progress in terms of advancing women's rights. I mean, I guess the hope is that over time, in all of the various activities in which peacebuilding takes place in a country like Afghanistan, that there will be spaces opened up, right? Whether through the National Human Rights Commission or whether through creating spaces for girls to go to school, that over time you build up enough critical mass that it comes onto the national agenda and gradually becomes an accepted part of the political discourse in countries like Afghanistan. Right? That it becomes acceptable to talk about women's rights. And more importantly, it becomes acceptable for women to talk about women's rights, as opposed to having male parliamentarians talking about women's rights in a male-dominated parliament.
Right. So how much of a priority does this tend to be in the whole peacebuilding process?
I think human rights in general and gender equality,
Right.
more specifically, tend to get written off too quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be nice if it was otherwise, but I think in terms of the sort of prioritization of relations with elites that I was talking about earlier,
Yeah.
I mean that tends to be the priority, and internationals are rarely willing to push so hard on questions of human rights that it upsets the dynamic with those in power.
Right.
Right? I mean, if the internationals were really serious about human rights in Afghanistan, most of the warlords who are currently in Parliament would actually be in The Hague.
That's right.
So, but with what impact, right? I mean, it was, well, as I said earlier, most of these people have their own militias, and they were the closest. They were the allies of the Americans in the fight against the Taliban. So they were the good guys. They were labeled the good guys at a certain point, despite sort of the dark side of most of them. So I think, particularly in a case like Afghanistan, where we come back to the question of whose interests are being served by the international intervention, there you get back into these questions of geopolitics, and I think too easily questions of human rights and equality we pay lip service to them, but at the end of the day, they end up being we don't put our money where our mouth is.
Exactly.
When the electronic media, the internet, I mean, just showing people what's going on in this world, but, you know, to what extent doesn't that filter through to what proportion of women in Afghanistan, for instance? I mean, doesn't that impact people everywhere when they see?
Yeah, I mean, I think in urban settings, I think it can, although Afghan is still very much a rural.
But it wouldn't get through to rural.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the vast majority of Afghanistan is not even electrified, let alone what people have. I mean, it's changing slowly. I mean, there's internet cafes in the same way that there is in a lot of other places. Haiti is really the same way. It's slowly percolating down, but there really still is, I think, a technological divide in terms of especially these kind of countries, because the infrastructure. Afghanistan went through 30 years of war, and the infrastructure is simply not there to provide rural areas with electricity, let alone broadband access. So again, I think there's an urban-rural divide, and I think for the purposes of gender, back to the earlier question about the fight for gender equality, I mean, it's more likely that those spaces that I talked about, where that debate was possible, will emerge in Kabul rather than out in the countryside, largely because of those sorts of issues.
As far as I can make out, there's a lot of, before the Taliban came along, women seem to have a lot of freedom, a lot of rights, and that. Before they came along, you meet a lot of Afghani women here, apart from them being outstandingly beautiful, but the ones that left are very intelligent and got really good jobs, so they come from that. But just a couple of other points with respect to how we're going backwards with women's rights. Let me leave that on one side. Women's rights all over the world, in all countries, are going backwards, even here. And every country in the world has got problems with the way men treat women. It doesn't matter whether it's Britain or here or whatever. And we somehow have to jump up and down, and men and women that care have to say this is wrong. So I'd just like to point that out, but the point I was going to say, we need to look at how Wahhabism is destroying women's rights. It's nothing to do with Islam or being a Muslim. It's a direct conflict with a lot of rights within the Muslim society. And so if the West were to actually go along and speak to people, like I've spoken to people, and find out that the way they indoctrinate people by giving them food or giving them oil, and they buy them off in a way that people don't always realize, as opposed to going and having war. And the other thing that we need to do is, if we could go on and set up schools in Afghanistan and other countries in the world and give them food, we'd have won the war anyway. Because that's the way madrasas work. The parents have kids, they haven't got enough money to feed them. The extreme, and this is only extreme Muslims. You know, I know hundreds of really wonderful Muslims that are, you know, incredible people. But some of the madrasas, the way they work is they take the child and they educate them and indoctrinate them at the same time. So if the West had any common sense, they'd have gone along and said, okay, we'll give you food, we'll give you schools, like some of the old Christian, missionaries used to do. But we seem to have lost any common sense because, I don't know, we seem to want to go and grab stuff and greed and oil and materialism, consumerism. You know, maybe you can
Well, I don't
Speak
know,
to
I mean,
that.
the case of Afghanistan of building schools, I mean, this is, if the Canadian military came back from Afghanistan with anything they claimed to have done, it was building schools and creating opportunities for girls in particular to go to school.
Mhm.
A lot of the schools were blown up by the Taliban in the aftermath, and I think what's happened as a result of 10 years of international occupation is that there's a real resentment on the part of Afghans towards internationals.
Yeah.
There's a sense that we've let them down, there's a sense that we're only there for our interests rather than for their interests. So the idea of going in and building schools and competing with the madrasas on
Yeah,
that
but if
level.
we'd gone and educate the men, forget the women,
Right.
I don't really forget the
Right.
women, but you've really got to educate
Right,
men to
socialise
not
the
be
men,
such
yeah.
twits,
Right.
putting it very mildly. So if you educate the men in schools, then you know, then they can start looking at stuff differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, like how I see that, I think like when you say that you don't want to compromise the human rights, but like seeing it from their perspective, like in Canada is way more advanced, but I lived many years in the US. In the US, gays cannot marry, they have death penalty, so I think it's morally incorrect to go saying like, we know what's right, this, you have to put human rights, when they just can face back and say, why don't you do it?
No, I didn't mean going as
No,
an
no, no.
indoctrination
No, no,
way,
no.
go and help them
No,
and
I
say,
was
you know,
like-
what
Yeah.
can we do to help you, sort of
Yeah.
thing. There was a guy on the CBC who said that about 4 years ago. And he said, why didn't you come to us and just say, what can we do to help you? As opposed to tell us what,
Right, I mean, that's
Yeah.
exactly it.
I have 9 o'clock.
really, congratulations. You've won the prize.